Flames tear through the night like angry serpents. The grand Georgian mansion, once a symbol of pride and power, is now breaking apart, beam by beam, scream by scream. The roof collapses inward with a thunderous groan. Smoke pours into the black sky, mixing with the cries of servants running for their lives. Glass shatters. Horses kick against their stalls. Somewhere within, the piano, that polished white piano, crashes into the floor below, its final note drowned beneath the roar of fire. From a distance, one figure doesn't move. He stands beneath a willow tree, his face lit in flickers of orange and red. The fire's reflection dances across eyes that have seen too much. Eyes that don't flinch. His name is Abel, the enslaved carpenter, the man who built this house, board by board, with hands that had no freedom, only skill. The wind shifts, carrying the scent of burning oak and varnish. Abel doesn't step forward, he simply watches. The flames to him are not destruction, they are release. The mansion groans again, its great staircase snapping like bone. Somewhere the master's voice rises, shouting orders, calling for buckets, for salvation. But salvation doesn't come tonight. Abel whispers under his breath, barely audible over the fire, "Let it fall." The mansion gives one last scream, a twisting, cracking sound that echoes through the valley, and then it begins to collapse inward as if the earth itself were swallowing it whole. The great pillars buckle, the upper floors fold. In seconds, the grand house becomes a mountain of smoke and ruin. For the townsfolk who will arrive at dawn, it will look like an accident. They'll say the fire spread too fast, that the wood was old, that no one could have known. But someone did. Someone built it to fall. A whip of wind carries sparks across the field. Abel's coat flickers with ember light. His hands, those same hands that carve the banisters, polish the floors, and cut every joint, are still. He doesn't smile. He doesn't weep. He only watches the fire consume the past. Behind him the night hums with frogs and crickets, unaware of what's ending. In the distance the church bell rings. 1, 2, 3 slow tolls. By morning the county will be awake. The sheriff will ride out, the preacher will pray, and the rich will whisper of curses. But for now, there's only silence, flame, and the hollow sound of wood breaking apart. Abel turns away. His face disappears into shadow. His footsteps sink softly into the wet grass as he walks toward the river. Behind him, the mansion's chimneys collapse like broken crowns. Was it an accident? A spark caught in the wrong wind? Or had justice been quietly carved into the house from the moment it was built? History will never know. But tonight, one man does. And as the fire devours everything, the world finally feels, to him, perfectly level. Morning comes with the smell of smoke and ruin. The sun rises over Georgia's red clay hills, casting its first light on the blackened skeleton of what used to be Colonel Harlan's pride, the grandest mansion in 3 counties. The air hums with flies, the ground still warm beneath the ashes. A single chimney stands crooked like a gravestone over buried secrets. Sheriff Dalton rides slow through the wreckage, his boots crunching over charred glass. "Ain't seen nothing like this," he mutters. His deputy kicks at the ashes, pulling out a half-melted candlestick. No bodies, no proof, just smoke and silence. By noon, the town gathers. Farmers, traders, servants, all drawn to the ruins like moths. They whisper to one another in half-belief. "Heard it caught in the night," one says. "Lightning, maybe." "Lightning?" another spits. "Sky was clear, not a drop of rain." Old women clutch their shawls. Tighter. One of them leans forward, her voice trembling. "It weren't no accident. That house, it was cursed. Wood don't rot that fast." The camera lingers on the beams, cracked clean through the center, hollowed like bones sucked dry. Strange, deliberate cuts line the timbers. The sheriff squats beside them, running a calloused hand along the split. "Looks weak from the inside," he says. His deputy frowns. "Termites?" Dalton shakes his head. "No. This was done by a man who knew what he was doing." By evening the gossip spreads across the countryside. In taverns and fields the story grows teeth. Some say the fire started in the kitchen. Others claim it began in the walls, like the house was burning itself. A merchant swears he heard screams hours before the blaze. A preacher declares it divine punishment. But in the quiet corners of the county, another kind of whisper begins, the kind that carries fear, the name spoken soft, like an old ghost story. Abel. No one's seen him since the night of the fire. His small shack behind the stables is empty. His tools are gone, his bed untouched. Even the old hammer he never left behind has vanished. Down by the river, search parties find footprints leading toward the cypress groves. Then, nothing. The prints vanish in the mud, as if the land itself swallowed him. At the sheriff's office, Dalton sits by lantern light, flipping through the mansion's old construction records. One name appears again and again in the margins, written in small, steady script. Abel, Carpenter. He leans back, staring into the flame of his lamp. You build a man's home, he mutters, and you build his tomb. Outside, the town settles into uneasy silence. Smoke still drifts from the ashes, curling upward like a final breath. In the distance, a woodpecker taps against a dead tree, hollow, rhythmic, deliberate, almost like a man with a hammer. No one notices the faint imprint of a hand burned into one surviving beam. Fingers pressed deep like someone saying goodbye. And for two, those who pass by that ruin in the weeks to come, they all swear to the same thing. At dusk, when the light hits just right, you can still hear the groan of the mansion collapsing, and the faint echo of someone whispering through the wind, "Let it fall." Before the fire, before the whispers, there was silence, the heavy kind that hangs over auction blocks. Chains clinked against bare wrists as men were lined up under the Georgia sun. The air shimmered with heat, and the smell of sweat, fear, and dust filled the square. That was the day Abel's name was stripped from him and sold for a price. "Strong arms, knows carpentry," the trader shouted, slapping a tag against Abel's chest. The crowd nodded, appraising him like they would a mule. Colonel Harland, a man with polished boots and an ego to match, raised his hand. "I'll take him," he said. The gavel hit wood. Abel's life changed forever. They said he didn't speak for days after arriving at the Harland estate. He simply looked, watched, measured everything with quiet eyes. The angle of the roof lines, the symmetry of the columns, the way the old house leaned just slightly toward the east. A man who sees in structure, not chaos. The master noticed. "He's got the hands of a builder," Harland said, puffing his cigar. "Put him to work on the new mansion. If he's as clever as they say, I'll have him build something fit for a king." And so Abel became a ghost in wood and nails. Every morning before the first light broke, he was already at the saw pit, the rasping sound of blade on pine filling the air. He carved perfection out of punishment. The other enslaved workers whispered about him. "Abel don't talk much. He don't need to. He listens." His hands moved with precision, his face calm, but his mind was always elsewhere. Every cut, every joint, every nail, he remembered. He studied how pressure traveled through timber, how the weight of a house rested on its weakest bones. Sometimes, when no one was watching, he'd run his hand along the wood grain and whisper to it, almost like a prayer. "You understand me, don't you? You hold what they can't see." One night, under a full moon, another carpenter, an older man named Josiah, found him tracing the frame of a staircase. "You fixin' to make this place stronger?" Josiah asked. Abel looked up, eyes cold. "Stronger for who?" Josiah sighed. "You can't win against men like him." Abel's reply was quiet but sharp. "I don't need to win. I just need it to end." He was different from the others. Not just in skill, but in patience. He could wait years if he had to. He understood that revenge wasn't about rage, it was about design. Days turned into seasons. The mansion grew, a white beast rising from red earth. Harlan praised his carpenter, called him the best in the South. Abel only nodded. The praise meant nothing. Late one evening, Abel paused by the great central beam, the one that would bear the mansion's heart. He pressed his palm against it, feeling the pulse of the structure. "Even the strongest can break," he whispered, "if you know where to touch." Behind him, thunder rolled over the Georgia fields. He didn't look up. He already knew. Storms always come for the proud. And in that quiet moment, the foundation of Harlan's empire began to take shape. Not in strength, but in the secret weakness carved by the hands of the enslaved man who built it. By the time the mansion began to rise, the land itself seemed to bow beneath its weight. Colonel Harlan called it his monument, a palace of white columns and shimmering windows that would make the world remember his name. But for Abel, every beam was a sentence, every nail a wound hammered into the earth. At dawn, the fog hung low over the fields as he walked toward the half-built house. The frame stood tall against the pale sky, T skeleton of oak and pine catching the morning light. Abel's hands were rough and scarred, his back lined with welts from years of labor, but his gaze remained sharp. He studied the beams like a man reading scripture, seeing not beauty, but consequence. "Abel," the overseer's voice cracked through the still air, "you're to check the west wing joints again. The colonel wants it perfect." He nodded and moved to obey. Perfection. That was what they wanted. What they didn't know was that perfection could be the most fragile thing in the world. Throughout the day, hammers rang, sawdust floated through the sunlight like smoke, and Abel moved among the workers with quiet focus. His touch guided the younger men, his voice low and sure. "You keep the grain tight here," he'd murmur. "Too loose, and the whole weight shifts." "But won't that make it?" one boy started. Abel silenced him with a look. "Just do as I say." When Colonel Harlan came to inspect the work, he wore his arrogance like a medal. "Fine craftsmanship," he said, stroking a polished banister. "When this house stands, it'll stand for 100 years. Abel bowed his head slightly. "If the beams hold, sir." Harlan laughed. "They'll hold. You built them." That night, after the lamps burned out and the overseer's boots faded down the road, Abel stayed behind. The moonlight spilled through the open rafters, silvering the dust in the air. He placed his hand on the main support beam and traced a small mark along its edge, so faint no one would ever see. He whispered, "You'll remember where to break." The house grew, week by week. The walls filled with laughter from the master's family, music from the piano that Harlan had shipped from New Orleans. But beneath the elegance, the structure groaned with invisible strain, pressure born from deliberate imperfection. Abel's nights grew longer. Sometimes he sat, in the shed, carving small wooden figures for the children of the quarters, little animals that couldn't cry, couldn't break. "Why you always staying up?" Josiah asked one evening. Abel didn't look up from his carving. "Because I'm building something bigger than a house." One stormy night, lightning flashed over the estate. Rain hammered the half-finished roof as Abel stood alone, watching water trickle through cracks he'd left unsealed. The wind howled through the frame, making it shudder like a living thing. He smiled, just faintly. "You're learning to fall," he whispered. When the sun rose, the sky was clear again, and the mansion gleamed in the light, a symbol of power, of wealth, of permanence. But hidden deep within its bones, weakness waited, silent and patient. And as Abel walked away from the site that morning, the camera lingers on his face, calm, unreadable, while behind him, the grand house creaks softly in the wind, as if testing its own strength. Nights on the Harlan estate were long and restless. Crickets droned in the fields, cicadas hummed in the trees, and deep inside his wooden shed, Abel worked in silence, measuring, cutting, marking. Every tool had its place, every movement a purpose. His mind was a blueprint of revenge. The mansion stood tall now, its frame complete, its bones cured by the southern sun. To the Harlans, it was beauty. To Abel, it was memory. Every nail a reminder, every grain of oak a scar he could touch. But beneath that calm surface, a plan was taking shape, as delicate as architecture, as cold as patience. He began studying at night by candlelight. Not the Bible, but his own sketches. Crude lines on rough parchment, cross-sections of beams, weight distribution, the hidden veins of the structure. To anyone else it looked like the work of a loyal craftsman ensuring perfection. To Abel it was anatomy, the anatomy of collapse. One night Josiah entered quietly. "You still drawing that house, Abel?" Abel didn't lift his eyes. "I'm unbuilding it." Josiah frowned. "You talking madness. You want get them to hang you." "They already did," Abel said softly. "They just forgot to take the rope off." The candle sputtered. Outside, the wind sighed through the cypress. Abel rolled his drawings tight and hid them in a hollow beam above the shed door. No one would ever think to look there, the secret resting inside the wood, like a ghost within bone. Days passed. Abel worked as usual, quiet and obedient, but sometimes his gaze lingered on certain parts of the mansion. The staircase supports, the roof trusses, the heavy central beam. His mind replayed each angle, each joint, calculating what could bear and what could break. One evening, as the last of the workers left, Abel stayed behind to inspect the joints. He knelt beneath the grand staircase, the very symbol of Harlan's pride, and tapped lightly with his hammer. Each sound told him something: the density of the wood, the tension hidden beneath the polish. He replaced one of the load-bearing pegs with a softer piece, a perfect copy to the eye but destined to give way under strain, then another, and another, not enough to draw suspicion, just enough to plant the seed of weakness. Later at the well, a young girl from the quarters asked him, "Mr. Abel, why you always workin' so late?" He smiled faintly. "I'm fixin' what's broken." "What's broken?" she asked. He looked toward the mansion glowing under the moonlight. Everything. Inside the house, laughter drifted through the windows. Colonel Harlan and his guests toasting to Southern greatness. Abel could hear the glasses clinking, the piano playing a waltz. He stood in the shadows, wiping his hands clean, whispering, "Dance while you can." That night, rain began to fall, soft and steady. Abel sat in his shed, listening as thunder rolled far away. He imagined the sound of wood swelling, joints shifting, the house exhaling under pressure. Nature would finish what he started. All he had to do was wait. He closed his eyes, hearing in the storm what no one else could: the faint, rhythmic creak of timber, like a heartbeat. And in that pulse he heard the promise of justice coming closer, one quiet crack at a time. Cruelty came to the Harlan estate like a sickness, slow at first, then all-consuming. It began with words, then with whips. By midsummer, the air itself seemed to tremble under the weight of the colonel's temper. Abel had learned to keep his eyes down, to move when spoken to never show the thoughts behind his silence, but even a man of patience can bleed inside. One evening, the overseer dragged a young boy across the yard, the boy's hands still clutching a broken fence post. "He dropped it," the overseer sneered. "Said his arms hurt." Colonel Harlan's voice cut through the air. "Then he doesn't need arms to work." The crack of the whip echoed through the fields. The boy's scream tore through Abel's chest, but he didn't move. He couldn't. His knuckles turned white around the handle of his hammer. Later that week, the cruelty reached his own home. His wife, Miriam, gentle, proud, and unbroken, had spoken up for a sick child who couldn't carry water. Harlan's wife accused her of insolence. The punishment came swift and brutal. Abel found her that night behind the smokehouse, her face bruised, her hands trembling. He knelt beside her, voice shaking. "Why?" Her eyes met his, eyes full of tears, yet blazing with fire. "Because I told them truth." He pressed his forehead to hers. "Then truth will answer." She gripped his shirt. "Don't you do nothing foolish." He looked toward the mansion glowing in the distance, candlelight flickering behind its perfect white windows. "No," he said, "only careful." From that night, something inside him hardened. He stopped sleeping. He worked longer hours, requested tasks near the house's foundation. The overseer has praised his diligence, never realizing what kind of devotion drove him. Abel began altering his rhythm, leaving certain braces untouched, cutting others just enough to fail one day in silence. He knew which walls bore weight, which pillars carried pride. Harlan's mansion was not just a house, it was the man himself, arrogant, brittle, blind to what lay beneath. One morning Harlan caught Abel inspecting the beams under the main hall. "You always worrying about something down there," he laughed. "You build fine, boy. She's strong." Abel looked up, expression calm. "Everything looks strong till the storm comes." Harlan chuckled, patting him on the shoulder. "That's why I keep a roof over your head, to keep the storm out." Abel's eyes flickered toward the man's hand. "Storm don't always come from the sky." That night, the workers in the quarters noticed Abel staring at the mansion, motionless. A child whispered, "He's thinking." Josiah replied, "No, he's remembering." Rain began to fall again. Slow, soft, the kind that sinks deep into the soil. Abel walked out into it, letting it wash over his face. In the flashes of lightning, the white mansion shimmered, tall and proud. He whispered to the wind, "You built your heaven on my back. Let's see if it stands on my silence." Behind him, thunder rolled across the valley. In that sound, something shifted. Not just in the sky, but in him. The line between patience and vengeance had vanished. And deep within the mansion's perfect bones, weakness waited, hidden, precise, and alive. The summer heat clung to Virginia like a curse. Days stretched long and heavy, the kind that made even the birds too tired to sing. But for Abel, the silence was a kind of language, the earth whispering to him that something was near. By day he worked as usual, sawdust sticking to his skin, sweat running down his spine. By night he walked the grounds, alone, patient, listening to the breath of the land. He had learned to read the house like scripture, every nail, every creak, every whisper of wood shifting under its own secrets. Abel sat alone under the tree by the well, sharpening his chisel with slow, deliberate strokes. The moonlight caught the blade, turning it into a silver smile. He thought of Miriam's hands, once soft, now scarred. He thought of the boy beaten for dropping wood, of the nights filled with screams swallowed by darkness. And then he thought of the fire, not yet real, but already alive in his mind. A few days later, as the Harlans hosted their evening feast, laughter spilled out of the grand hall like wine. Candles glowed in every window, violins sang. The smell of roasted meat and tobacco filled the night air. Servants rushed in and out, carrying trays, polishing silver, smiling when ordered to. Abel was among them, silent and invisible. He passed through rooms as if he were part of the walls, a ghost in plain sight. He paused near the staircase, his hand brushing the banister he had built years ago. The polished oak felt warm beneath his palm. It was beautiful, perfect, and ready to fall. From the dining room came Harlan's booming laughter. "To prosperity!" he shouted, raising his glass. The guests cheered. Abel's jaw tightened. Prosperity. That word burned. In the corner, Harlan's wife complained about the heat. "Feels like the house itself is sweatin'," she said, fanning herself. Abel turned toward the back hall. There, beneath the servants' corridor, a small oil lantern flickered by the storage door, placed exactly where it could tip, if nudged just right. He reached for it, steady hands trembling only once, his voice a whisper. "For every scream you silenced." But he stopped. Not yet. Not tonight. The wood wasn't weak enough. The moment wasn't full enough. He turned, leaving the lantern untouched. The fire could wait. The reckoning deserved perfection. As he stepped outside, thunder rumbled over the hills again. Deep, distant, promising. The storm was coming. And when it came, the mansion would not just burn, it would collapse, from the inside out. Morning came with the sound of distant thunder, not from the sky but from the earth itself. The mansion creaked like an old beast waking from sleep. Inside, the servants whispered that the walls were talkin' again. But to Abel, it wasn't talk, it was confession. The wood was groaning beneath the weight of years. And of sin. He spent the early hours in the east wing, tightening bolts, replacing beams, pretending to mend what he had already condemned. Harlan's overseer watched from the doorway, pipe in hand, suspicious as always. "You fixin' or breakin' boy?" he sneered. Abel didn't look up. "Wood's tired, sir," he murmured. "Needs rest before it splits." The overseer laughed, smoke curling from his mouth. "Like you folk. Always tired." Abel's hammer struck the beam once, twice, sharp, deliberate blows that echoed like a heartbeat. He let the sound hang in the air. Inside, the overseer shifted, uneasy. He didn't know why, but something in that sound felt like prophecy. As the day wore on, clouds thickened over Georgia. The light turned copper, heavy with storm. The mansion's windows rattled in the wind, their glass humming like nerves. Abel worked slower now, not from fatigue but anticipation. He was listening to the rhythm of the storm, waiting for its cue. In the quarters, Miriam watched him from afar. She had seen the change, the quiet fury behind his calm eyes. "You plannin' something, Abel?" she whispered when they crossed paths at the well. He didn't answer at first, just stared at the reflection of the house in the water. Finally he said, "I'm just building what they asked for." Her voice trembled. "And what's that?" He looked up, the faintest hint of a smile breaking his stillness. "An end." He looked up, the faintest hint of a smile breaking his stillness. An end. That night, as thunder rolled closer, the Harlans dined once more. The guests had left. Only family remained. Colonel Harlan drank heavy, his laughter turning into slurred orders. "Bring me the carpenter," he barked suddenly. "The West Wing floor's got a soft spot." Abel was fetched. He entered the dining hall with his tools, silent as the storm. Harlan jabbed a finger at the floor. "You built this damn place. Fix it." Abel knelt, pressing his hand to the plank. The boards trembled faintly beneath his palm. Just enough. "It's the beam, sir," he said quietly. "It's hollowing out." Harlan scoffed. "Then replace it. I won't have my house sagging like a barn." Abel rose to his feet. "You can't replace what's already rotten." The colonel froze, wine glass halfway to his lips. The words hung there, too calm, too bold. Miriam, clearing dishes in the background, nearly dropped a plate. "What did you say?" Harlan asked, his voice low. Abel met his gaze. "Some things, once hollow, can't be saved." The thunder outside cracked like a whip. Harlan's chair scraped back, his face twisting. "Get out, before I—" But Abel was already walking away, footsteps echoing through the hall like nails in a coffin. Outside, rain began to fall. Slow, steady, patient. Each drop tapped against the roof, seeping into the weakened beams below. The wood drank it like poison. In the quarters, the others couldn't sleep. The storm grew wild, rattling shutters and bending trees. "Feels wrong tonight," Josiah whispered. "Feels like something breathing beneath the house." And in the dark, Abel sat on his cot, eyes open, listening. Every gust of wind, every groan of timber told him the same thing. It was almost time. By dawn, the rain would pass, the sun would rise on a house that looked whole, proud, untouched. But the truth was buried deep. In the beams, in the bones, in the silence of a man who waited for justice to take form. And when it came, it would not ask for mercy. The morning after the storm felt strangely clean. The sky was too blue, the air too still. As if the world had been scrubbed of guilt overnight. But Abel knew better. The rain had not washed the mansion. It had seeped into it, whispering through the cracks he'd carved with his own hands. From the fields, the great house gleamed in the sunlight. To the master, it was a symbol of pride restored. To Abel, it was a hollow shell pretending to be whole. He moved through its halls quietly, checking his work beneath the guise of repairs. Every weakened joint, every hidden cut was breathing now, swollen from the rain, strained from the weight. A few more storms, a few more careless nights of laughter and dancing, and the house would betray its maker. Miriam found him in the west corridor, crouched beneath a support beam, tapping the wood with a chisel. "You still working?" she asked softly. Abel didn't look up. "Just listening." "To what?" He smiled faintly. "To the wood remembering." She knelt beside him, her hands trembling. "They'll blame you if it breaks. You know that." Abel looked up, his eyes calm, almost tender. "They already blame me for living. Might as well earn it." She wanted to speak, but his stillness silenced her. There was something unshakable in him now, something almost holy. Later that day, Colonel Harlan strutted across the front porch with a cigar between his teeth. "She's still standing," he said proudly to his overseer. "Built to last, that's what I paid for." The overseer chuckled. "Ain't nothing brings down Harlan timber." Abel, walking past with a cart of tools, caught their words. For a brief second, his jaw tightened. The overseer noticed. "Don't look so sour, boy. You ought to take pride in your master's house." Abel turned his head slowly. "I do. Every piece of it's got my mark." That night, lightning flickered again beyond the hills. Not a storm this time, just heat light, silent and distant. Inside the quarters, the others sat around the dim lantern, uneasy. "You hear it creaking?" Josiah asked. "The house. Been doing it all day." "Old wood swells when it rains," another muttered. Miriam shook her head. "Ain't the rain. It's Abel's hand." They turned to her, eyes wide. She spoke like in a trance. "He ain't breaking it for spite. He's setting it free." Outside, Abel stood beneath the stars, his hammer in one hand, his chisel in the other. The mansion loomed behind him, its windows glowing like watchful eyes. He took a slow breath, feeling the damp air fill his lungs. He could almost hear the walls breathing, slow, heavy, burdened. The structure was no longer just wood and stone, it was memory. Every scream, every lash, every night of fear, pressed into its beams, into its bones. He whispered, "You'll carry no more." At dawn the Harlans prepared for another gathering, a celebration of the harvest. Abel helped hang lanterns, fix tables, polish the railings. His movements were steady, careful. Each gesture disguised a final adjustment. A cut here, a loosened wedge there. Small, silent acts that shaped destiny inch by inch. When he finished, he stood before the mansion one last time. It was magnificent, tall, proud, defiant. The illusion of power built on the quiet labor of the unseen. He wiped his hands on his apron and said under his breath, "Let them dance on hollow ground." A breeze passed through, carrying the faint scent of pine resin and oil. The house groaned softly, as though it too understood. Inside, laughter already echoed, plates clattered, music stirred. Abel walked away, not looking back. Because some endings don't need to be seen, only heard, when the wood finally gives way. The night was thick with celebrati. On. Laughter spilled from every window of the Harlan mansion, lanterns swinging in the humid air. Fiddles sang, boots stomped against polished floors, and for a few hours, the masters of the land forgot that their kingdom was built on borrowed blood. Abel stood beneath the oak outside, his silhouette swallowed by darkness. He could see the ballroom lights flickering through the trees, hear the faint echo of music, the sound of arrogance before a fall. His hands were still, but his mind burned. Inside, Miriam moved between the tables, serving wine, bread, and meat. Her eyes kept searching the crowd, always finding Abel through the glass. He hadn't come in. He never did during these nights. But this time she knew. Something was different. The mansion pulsed with life. The walls glowed warm, unaware they were already dying. The weakened beams deep within the structure held firm. For now. But the damp had swollen them, hairline fractures spreading like veins beneath skin. One hard stomp, one shift of weight, one careless laugh, and the illusion could shatter. Colonel Harlan raised his glass. "To prosperity, to the soil that feeds us and the hands that serve us." The guests cheered, clinking glasses. Miriam froze. The words tasted like poison. In the shadows outside, Abel whispered, "To the hands that built you." Lightning flashed over the horizon, painting the sky bone white. For a heartbeat, the world looked frozen. The mansion glowing against the dark, the laughter still, the music suspended mid-note. Then the sound returned, but softer, slower, uneasy. From the far corner of the house came a faint creak, a groan deep in the wood. None of the guests heard it over the music. But Abel did. His eyes lifted, steady, unblinking. He began walking toward the house, each step slow, measured, inevitable. Inside, the overseer was laughing at a story when the chandelier above trembled. Crystals clinked together softly, like teeth. A few guests looked up, then shrugged. Miriam noticed first. The sound wasn't the wind. It was the house breathing, exhaling for the first time in years. She moved toward the kitchen door, whispering to the servants, "Go outside, now." "Why?" one asked, confused. "Just go, please." They hesitated, but her eyes made them obey. One by one, they slipped out through the back, leaving trays half filled, dishes half cleaned. Abel reached the porch. Rain began to fall again. Slow, fat drops that hissed when they hit the ground. He looked up at the mansion. It was beautiful in the stormlight, like a cathedral built for cruelty. Then inside, a crack, not loud, just sharp, precise, final, the kind of sound a man remembers for life. The west beam gave way. The floor above it sagged. Screams cut through the music. The violin wailed a single broken note before silence swallowed everything. "Get out!" someone shouted. "The floor!" But it was too late. The ballroom buckled, furniture slid, guests stumbled as the center of the floor sank like a pit. Chandeliers tore loose, glass exploding, candles scattering fire across silk and oak. From outside, Abel watched through the rain, his face unmoving. The mansion shook once, twice. Then the roof caved in with a sound like thunder itself. Flames leapt skyward, orange against the black. Smoke billowed into the night, carrying with it the voices of the fallen. Cries of disbelief, of pain, of fear. Miriam ran to Abel, gasping, "What did you do?" He looked at her, eyes steady. I built it honest. It just couldn't hold lies anymore. Behind them the mansion groaned, then collapsed fully. A monument of power reduced to dust and memory. The rain fell harder, hissing as it met the flames. Abel stood silent, soaked and still, the glow of the burning house reflected in his eyes. The reckoning had come, and the land itself seemed to breathe in relief. The fire aged long into the night, swallowing everything it touched. The sound was monstrous. Timbers cracking, glass bursting, walls exhaling their last breaths in plumes of black smoke. The sky above Georgia glowed orange, visible for miles. By the time the rain began to die, the mansion was gone. Only its bones remained, charred beams jutting from the earth like ribs of a buried giant. The fields around it steamed, slick with ash and memory. Abel stood at the edge of the ruin, face lit by the fading glow. The air stank of wet soot and burned linen. From the wreckage came faint groans, survivors maybe, or ghosts that hadn't yet realized they were dead. Miriam stood behind him, trembling. "You did this," she whispered. Abel didn't turn. "No," he said quietly. "They did. I just stopped fixing what was already broken." In the distance, Josiah and the others emerged from the darkness, faces pale in the dawn's first gray light. They said nothing. They didn't need to. The silence between them was heavy, not fear, but awe. The overseer was found at sunrise, crawling through the mud, one arm twisted, his face half burned. He screamed when he saw Abel walking toward him. You did this," he rasped. "You devil." Abel knelt beside him, voice calm, almost gentle. "You called me that before. Difference is, now you're right." The overseer spat blood and ash. "They'll hang you, every one of you." Abel stood slowly. "Maybe," he said, "but not today." By noon, riders arrived. Neighboring planters, soldiers, men with guns and questions. They searched the ruins, pulled out bodies, argued over what had happened. The story began to twist before the smoke had even cleared. "Lightning," one said. "Careless fire from the kitchen," said another, but the overseer, still half-conscious, kept muttering the same thing. The carpenter did it." Abel didn't hide. He sat by the well, sharpening his chisel as he always had, watching the men sift through the ash. His calm unnerved them. A soldier approached, rifle slung over his shoulder. "You there," he said. "You work here?" Abel nodded. "Where were you when the fire started?" He looked up, meeting the man's eyes. "Watching it end." The soldier frowned. "End?" Abel said nothing more. Miriam, standing nearby, felt her stomach twist. She knew what was coming. The truth, or something close enough, would spread like flame through dry grass. The story of an enslaved carpenter who built his master's mansion, then watched it fall. By evening the smoke thinned, leaving only silence. The plantation, once proud and alive, was now a graveyard of splintered wood and melted iron. Abel walked through the ruins, his boots sinking into ash. He touched a fragment of wood, one of his beams, still warm, still fragile. He closed his eyes. For years he had built homes for others, never his own. This one at least would stand in memory as his work, his justice. Behind him, Miriam called softly, "What'll happen to us now?" He turned, his face unreadable. "Ain't sure, but whatever it is, it'll be on clean ground." The last of the fire hissed out in the wet soil, and for the first time the air felt light, almost free. As night fell again, the ruins went dark. No lanterns, no laughter, no master's voice, just the chirp of crickets and the sigh of wind through the broken beams. Abel sat in the ashes until dawn, chisel still in hand. The same hands that once built a house of power had finally brought it down. And though no one said it aloud, everyone knew. The land had changed. Not by the storm, not by accident, but by a man who remembered what justice sounded like, wood breaking under its own lies. Morning spread across the fields like smoke that refused to fade. The mansion was gone, but its shadow still lingered, burned into the eyes of everyone who'd seen it fall. The enslaved quarters were quiet, eerily so. No laughter, no crying, just the soft, uncertain shuffle of feet on damp ground. The master's world had ended overnight, but the enslaved didn't cheer. They watched the ashes drift in the breeze, unsure if this was freedom, or the beginning of another kind of reckoning. Abel sat on the well's stone rim, his chisel lying beside him, blackened by soot. His hands were steady, his eyes hollow. He'd done it. He had brought down the house that stood as a monument to his chains. But victory, when it finally came, felt less like triumph and more like silence. Miriam approached slowly, a scarf tied over her hair. "They're sayin' soldiers comin' from town," she said. Abel nodded. "They'll come. Always do." "What'll you tell 'em?" He looked up at her. "Nothin'. Ain't my story to tell no more." The sun rose higher, spreading gold over blackened ruins. Birds began to return, cautious, circling, as if testing whether the curse had lifted. The air smelled of ash and wet earth. For a fleeting moment, it felt like the land was breathing again. Then came the riders. 5 of them. Blue coats, muskets, stern faces. They dismounted at the edge of the ruins, surveying the devastation. One of them, a young officer, removed his hat. "God Almighty," he muttered. "What happened here?" The overseer, half-bandaged and pale, staggered forward. "It was him," he rasped, pointing a trembling hand toward Abel. "The carpenter. He did it. He burned the house. Killed 'em all." The soldiers turned. Abel didn't move. He met their gaze with the calm of a man who had already walked through fire. The officer stepped closer. "Is that true?" Abel's voice was low, measured. "Aye, buoy. Lot that house. I warned him it wasn't safe." The officer frowned. "That doesn't answer my question." Abel stood, slow and deliberate. "I told the truth. They chose to ignore it, so the house did the rest." The officer exchanged glances with his men, unsure whether they were hearing confession or poetry. "You expect me to believe that?" Abel shrugged faintly. "Believe what you want. The truth don't need believers." Miriam took a step forward, trembling. "He ain't done nothing but build. The storm made the rest happen." The overseer spat, voice cracking. "Storm, my foot. He's the storm." The soldiers conferred quietly, then the officer gestured. "Take him." 2 men moved toward Abel. He didn't resist. He simply picked up his chisel, wiped it clean on his sleeve, and handed it to Miriam. "Keep it sharp," he said. "Might need it again one day." She clutched it to her chest, eyes glistening. "Abel." He met her gaze, calm, even gentle. "Don't let him bury the truth. Just let it breathe." They led him away, past the smoldering ruins, through the fields he'd once built fences for. The soil clung to his boots, heavy, alive. Behind him the other workers watched in silence, not as slaves anymore, but as witnesses. As the soldiers rode off, the ruins shimmered in the heat. The smoke twisted upward, curling into strange shapes, almost like hands rising toward heaven. Miriam stood where he had been, the chisel still warm in her palm. Around her, the wind stirred the ashes, whispering his name. And in that whisper was something neither grief nor guilt could kill. The sound of a promise kept. For though the man was gone, his work remained. And somewhere beneath the soil, the house still groaned. Not from pain, but from memory. The ride to town was long, silent, and heavy with the smell of rain-soaked earth. The soldiers didn't speak to Abel. They didn't have to. Each man carried a quiet unease, as though the one they escorted wasn't a prisoner, but a force of nature that had already passed its sentence. Abel's hands were bound, his wrists raw against the rope, but his posture stayed straight, his eyes fixed on the horizon. To anyone watching, he looked less like a man being taken away and more like someone guiding others toward a truth they didn't want to see. When they reached the town square, word had already spread. People gathered along the muddy street, planters, merchants, and curious townsfolk whispering stories. The carpenter burned it down himself. They say he weakened the wood. Devil's in him, they say. Devil's justice. Abel was marched into the small jailhouse near the courthouse. The sheriff, an older man with tobacco-stained fingers, leaned back in his chair, squinting through the haze of his cigar. "So you're the one they talking about," he said. "The man who brought down the Harlans." Abel said nothing. The sheriff flicked ash into a tin. "They say you used your tools to cut through beams. That true?" Still silence. The sheriff leaned forward. "You understand what they'll do to you, don't you?" Abel finally spoke, his voice calm and low. "Ain't no worse than what's already been done." That answer lingered in the air like smoke. The sheriff studied him for a long moment, then said, "Funny thing is, some folks out there calling you a monster, others calling you a ghost. You got 'em scared either way." Abel's eyes lifted. "Maybe fear's the only thing they understand." The sheriff exhaled, leaned back again. "You sound like a man who thinks he did right." "I didn't do right," Abel said softly. "I just stopped letting wrong stand." Through the small barred barrier in Dow, Abel could see the streets filling with rain again. Every drop hit the mud like a heartbeat. He remembered that night, the flames reflected in the puddles, the screams swallowed by thunder. A knock came at the door. The officer who'd arrested him stepped in, hat in hand. "Sheriff," he said quietly, "Colonel Harlan's wife. She's alive." The sheriff's eyes widened. "Alive? Where?" "They found her near the stables. Burned bad, but she's talking. Says the fire started in the East Hall. Says she saw him." The officer glanced at Abel. "By the stairs before it fell." The sheriff turned slowly back to Abel. "That true?" Abel didn't answer. He stared through the window, the reflection of his face mingling with the rain. The sheriff sighed. "You know, son, truth got a funny way of disappearing when men like them start talking. If you got something to say, now's the time." Abel closed his eyes for a moment, then said quietly, "The truth don't disappear. It just waits for the right ears." The sheriff didn't press further. He ordered Abel locked in a cell, a small, dark room that smelled of rust and old wood. As the door shut, the echo of iron rang through the hall. That night, the jailer heard something strange. Not prayers, not sobbing, but the soft, rhythmic sound of metal scraping against stone, like a chisel being sharpened. He peeked through the slot and saw Abel sitting cross-legged in the dim light, humming low under his breath. His hands moved slow, steady, shaping something unseen in the air. When asked later what he was doing, Abel's answer was simple: "Buildin'." The jailer frowned. "Buildin' what?" Abel looked up, eyes calm and distant. "A new kind of house." The man backed away, unsettled. Outside, thunder rolled again over Georgia. And in the cell, Abel smiled faintly, not with triumph, but with peace. Because even caged, a builder still remembers how to make something stand, even if that something is a legend. The morning came slow and gray, the kind of dawn that felt like judgment. The rain had stopped, but the street still shimmered with puddles that caught the faint light of a sun too weak to burn through the clouds. The courthouse bell rang once, then twice, calling the town to gather. Abel was to stand trial. Inside the wooden courtroom, benches creaked under the weight of planters, merchants, and preachers. Every face turned to see the man they called the builder who broke his own house. At the front sat Judge Tatum, an aging man whose robe smelled faintly of whiskey and damp paper. His gavel rested beside a Bible that looked worn from show, not faith. Abel was led in, chains clinking softly. He wore no shoes, just torn trousers and a linen shirt that had seen both labor and flame. Still, his shoulders were square, his eyes steady. He looked less like a criminal and more like a man who had already made peace with something larger than law. "Abel of Georgia," the judge began, voice sharp, echoing off the wood. "You are charged with the crime of arson, the destruction of property, and the deaths of 3 members of the Harlan family. How do you plead?" The courtroom fell silent. Abel looked up. "I don't plead, sir," he said. "I just speak." A murmur rippled through the benches. The judge frowned. "Then speak." Abel's voice was calm, but it carried through the room like a sermon. "I built that house. Every beam, every stair, every board that kept their boots dry and their supper warm. I carved the names of their children into wood so they'd remember who they were. But when it came to me, I was just a hand, not a man." A planter in the back scoffed. "You knew your place, boy. That was enough." Abel turned his gaze toward the voice. "Then maybe that's the problem. You call it my place, but it was your weight that kept me there." The judge banged the gavel. "Order!" But the tension had already split the room. Half the crowd looked away in shame, the other half in anger. The prosecutor, a young man with a slick voice, stepped forward. "Mr. Abel, we have testimony that you weakened the beams weeks before the fire, that you confessed to other servants you'd bring the house down. What say you?" Abel nodded slowly. "I said that. I meant it. but not just for me. For every soul buried in those fields whose names never got carved." The judge's hand trembled on his gavel. "Are you admitting guilt?" Abel paused, then spoke softly. "If guilt means I struck the first blow against a thing already rotten, then yes." Gasps filled the courtroom. The prosecutor's jaw tightened. "So you did it for vengeance?" Abel's eyes lifted toward the ceiling, as if the beams above were still his to judge. "Not vengeance, balance." The judge's voice grew cold. "You speak of balance while families burn?" Abel turned to him. "And how many burned already, Judge? You ever see a man whipped till his back looked like fire? You ever smell flesh under the sun and call it discipline?" The courtroom went dead quiet. The judge swallowed hard, his authority cracking under the weight of the truth. He looked down at his papers but couldn't read them anymore. From the back an old woman stood, a washerwoman who'd worked on the Harland estate years before. Her voice shook. "He's speaking truth," she said. "That house was built on bones. Maybe it was time it fell." The sheriff stepped forward quickly. "Sit down, ma'am." But it was too late. The crowd had changed. Eyes shifted. Whispers began. Not of guilt, but of reckoning. The judge's gavel struck again and again, desperate to control what could no longer be controlled. "Enough," he shouted. "This is a court of law, not a church of rebellion." Abel smiled faintly. "Sometimes the two ain't so different. Rent." The judge's face flushed red. "You'll hang for this, boy." Abel nodded. "Then I'll hang free." The gavel came down one final time, the sound sharp as thunder. But outside the courthouse the wind picked up, sweeping through the trees, through the empty fields, through the ruins of the Harland estate where smoke still rose faintly from the ashes. And in that wind, for those who listened close, it almost sounded like the creak of wood giving way, the echo of a house falling again, not from fire, but from truth finally spoken. The verdict came before sunset. The bell tolled 3 times, each ring heavier than the last. Outside the courthouse the townspeople waited, some eager for justice, others silent, as if unsure what justice even meant anymore. The papers would later call it swift sentencing, but for Abel, it was the long breath between one kind of captivity and another. Inside, Judge Tatum read the sentence without looking up. "For the crimes of arson, destruction of property, and murder by fire, you are hereby condemned to hang by the neck until dead. May God have mercy on your soul." Abel didn't flinch. His hands were still cuffed, wrists bruised and raw, but his voice was steady. "And may he have mercy on yours, Judge." The guards pulled him away, the chains scraping across the floorboards that he himself might have built. The irony didn't escape him. Every inch of that courthouse, from the beams to the bench, had once been touched by a man who now stood condemned beneath them. Outside, the sky was red, not the soft red of dusk, but the deep, bleeding red that looked like the memory of fire. The people watched as Abel was led through the square. Some spat, some bowed their heads. A few, mostly the enslaved and freed laborers standing in the shadows, met his eyes and held them, silent but proud. In the jailhouse the cell was small, but not unfamiliar. He'd known tighter spaces. He'd known chains heavier than these. The guard, a young man with pale eyes and trembling hands, placed a bowl of stew in front of Himpsy. "You get 1 meal before dawn," he muttered. Abel smiled faintly. "I've eaten less before harder days." The guard hesitated at the door. "Why'd you do it? You could have run. You could have crossed the river, made it north." Abel leaned back, his voice quiet. "A man can run his whole life and still never be free. I built that house with my hands. I couldn't leave it standing, knowing what it stood for." The guard didn't answer. He closed the door and left the lantern burning low. As the night deepened, rain began to fall again. Soft, rhythmic, almost tender. Abel sat on the floor, tracing invisible lines in the dirt, like he was still measuring wood, still carving something that only he could see. He thought of Sarah, his wife, sold 2 winters before, her laugh, her humming as she washed clothes by the river. He thought of his son, born in secret, hidden away so the overseer wouldn't find him. He wondered if they'd ever hear his name again, or if it would fade like sawdust in the wind. A whisper came from the cell beside him. "Abel, that you?" He turned. It was Jonah, another enslaved man, locked up for striking his master. "It's me," Abel said softly. Jonah's voice was rough. "They say they'll hang you come sunrise." Abel nodded. "So they say." A long pause. Then Jonah spoke again. "You scared?" Abel smiled, eyes on the dim light. "I was scared every day I woke up alive in chains. But this? This is just one more nail, and I've driven nails all my life. The two men sat in silence, the kind of silence that carries history. Not empty, but full of everything unsaid. Outside, thunder rolled far away. Somewhere a church bell echoed, though no one knew who rang it. Abel closed his eyes. In his mind he saw the mansion again. The Harland estate in its prime. Polished floors, chandeliers, laughter behind glass doors. He saw himself standing beneath the beams, hammer in hand, sweat dripping, each swing of his arm building the weight that would one day bury his masters. He saw the flames again too, golden, roaring, cleansing. When the guard returned at dawn, Abel was already awake. Calm. Ready. The young man looked at him, unable to meet his gaze for long. "Any last words for the preacher?" he asked. Abel shook his head. "Tell him I've been talking to God all along. He just never answered till now." The guard swallowed hard. Outside, the noose waited beneath the oak tree. But for Abel, the night had already given him what the world never could. Peace. The morning of the hanging arrived cloaked in fog, the kind that swallowed sound and blurred the line between the living and the dead. The square was already full before the sun broke through. Men in coats, women with parasols, children sitting on their fathers' shoulders, too young to understand they were about to watch history disguised as punishment. The gallows stood in the center, built from rough pine, fresh, unweathered. The wood creaked as the wind shifted, almost as if it knew it wasn't meant to bear this kind of weight. The rope dangled above the trapdoor, new and stiff. Beside it stood Sheriff Dunn, face pale, hat low, a man caught between duty and dread. Abel was led out in irons, bare feet on cold mud. The crowd murmured, their voices a low, uneasy hum. A preacher followed behind, reciting from the book of Psalms. "The Lord is my shepherd." Abel's eyes didn't lift. He didn't look at the gallows or the faces waiting to see him die. He looked east, toward the hills where the mansion once stood. Smoke no longer rose from that place, but the ground still carried its scent, burnt wood, ash, memory. A woman stepped out from the crowd, clutching a worn shawl. Her voice trembled. "He didn't kill them. The beams were rotten long before." A soldier shoved her back. "Quiet down, woman." But the murmur spread. Some nodded, some shushed her. Others whispered that the house had been cursed from the moment it was built. The sheriff cleared his throat. "Bring him forward." The guards obeyed, leading Abel to the platform. He walked without hesitation, as if ascending to a place he had already seen in a dream. The boards beneath his feet creaked softly, the same sound wood makes when surrendering to age or truth. When he reached the top, the preacher held up his Bible. "Son, repent before your Maker." Abel met his eyes. "I already did. The day I stopped building their heaven with my hell." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The preacher stepped back, face pale as paper. Sheriff Dunn's jaw clenched. "Any last words?" Abel's gaze swept across the faces below. Some curious, some cruel, some haunted. Then he spoke. "You called me slave, but I was the one who built your homes. You called me sinner, but I never raised a whip. You'll hang me for breaking beams, but never once did you hang a man for breaking a life." A hush fell. The wind rose. The sheriff's hand trembled as he reached for the lever. Abel turned toward the horizon one last time. The sun had begun to rise, its light cutting through the fog, painting the world in gold. "Tell my boy," he whispered. "I built something that stood long after the wood was gone." The trapdoor fell. The rope snapped tight. For a second, the world held its breath. Then a sound, a splinter, a crack, echoed through the square. The beam above the gallows gave way, groaning under strain. The wood split in two, and the platform collapsed. Gasps erupted. Sheriff Dunn stumbled backward as the preacher screamed, "Lord, have mercy!" Abel's body hit the ground, alive, stunned, the noose broken. The crowd surged forward, chaos in motion. Some called it a miracle, others a curse. The sheriff, shaken, knelt beside him. "You still breathing?" Abel coughed once, dirt and blood on his lips. "Wood don't hold lies for long," he whispered. The sheriff froze. The preacher crossed himself. From the edge of the square, that same woman with the shawl shouted, "You see, the Lord spared him." But before anyone could act, a soldier drew his pistol. The sheriff shouted, "Don't!" But it was too late. The shot rang out. Abel's body jerked once, then stilled. Silence. No cheers, no prayers, only the sound of the fog rolling in again, swallowing the square in gray. And somewhere beyond the courthouse, a beam in the ruins of the Harland estate creaked once more, faint, hollow, like the echo of unfinished work. By evening, whispers spread across Georgia. Some said the rope broke because the wood came from the same lot Abel had once carved, wood that refused to take his life. Others swore the wind carried his final words into the trees, where no one could silence them. No record survives of who buried him. Only that when morning came, the grave was found empty, and the earth above it freshly disturbed, as though someone, or something, had carried him home. The news spread faster than the fire ever had. By dusk, whispers of the carpenter who broke the rope echoed through every tavern, every field, every whispered prayer between shacks and quarters. To the enslaved, it was a sign, a message carved not in wood, but in fate. To the masters, it was something else entirely. Fear. Sheriff Dunn sat alone in his office, hat off, hands trembling. The smell of gunpowder still clung to him. He'd seen men die before, but this felt different. His deputy leaned in the doorway, voice low. "You think the rope really just broke?" The sheriff didn't answer at first. He stared at the broken fibers lying on his desk, frayed and split clean down the middle. "I seen ropes older than this hold twice the weight," he muttered. "Something ain't right." Outside, the church bell rang for evening service, but few attended. The preacher who'd stood at the gallows that morning hadn't spoken since. Some said he was found kneeling by the collapsed platform, whispering, "God's work is done." Others swore he'd left town before sunset, barefoot and shaking. That night the mansion's ruins stirred again. Children playing near the ashes claimed they saw a shadow move among the collapsed beams. A figure, tall, silent, with eyes like embers in the dark. They ran home screaming that Abel's ghost was walking the earth. By morning the stories grew. A slave overseer swore he found fresh footprints in the mud near the ruins, bare feet, large, like Abel's. Another said the beam that once hung above the gallows had been split again during the night, clean, as if cut by a carpenter's hand. But the most unsettling rumor came from a trader who rode through the county at dawn. He said he passed a man walking barefoot on the road north, tall, scarred, wearing a rope around his neck like a loose crown. When he called out, the man turned once and said, "Wood remembers what hands built it," then vanished into the fog. Back in town, the tension boiled. The plantation owners met in secret. "We can't let this story spread," one hissed. "They'll think he's a saint." "Then bury it," another snapped. "Erase his name, burn the papers, the records, everything." And so they did. Court documents disappeared. His cell was scrubbed clean. The gallows were torn down by nightfall. By dawn it was as if Abel had never existed. But truth has a way of surviving. The enslaved began carving his name into tree trunks, into the undersides of tables, into the backs of pews where no one would see. Abel. 4 letters that carried more weight than any sermon. In the cabins, old women whispered his story like scripture. He built their world, they'd say. Then he showed 'em it could fall. Years later, when Union soldiers marched through Georgia, they'd find strange carvings on abandoned estates, crosses, beams, and the outline of a hand holding a hammer. When asked at what it meant, freedmen would smile quietly. "That's the mark of the builder," they'd say. Sheriff Dunn grew old carrying the guilt. Some nights he'd wake to the sound of hammering in the distance, slow, deliberate, echoing through the hills. He'd open his window and listen, heart pounding, knowing the mansion had long since turned to dust. One evening before his death, he left a note on his desk. It read, "The rope broke clean, not from weakness but from will. The man they hanged wasn't meant to die that day. Maybe he never did." When they found him the next morning, the sheriff's chair was empty. His hat still hung on the wall. And through the open window, the night wind carried the faint sound of wood splitting, as if someone was still building, somewhere beyond the edge of the map. Decades passed. The land healed, but not evenly. The Harland estate was gone, swallowed by vines and silence. Only the foundation stones remained, half buried in the dirt, like teeth from a creature long dead. Locals said the ground never grew right there again. The soil refused crops and the air always smelled faintly of smoke after rain. A century later, a young historian from Atlanta arrived with a notebook and an old map. Her name was Clara Ellis, a doctoral student tracing the architecture of early Georgia plantations. She wasn't looking for ghosts, just records, but what she found was something no archive had ever shown her. The villagers called it Abel's Field. They warned her not to go near it after dusk. Some things, an old man told her, ain't meant to be studied, they meant to be remembered. She smiled politely, dismissing it as folklore, but when she reached the ruins, the air changed. It was still, heavy. She brushed aside ivy and saw it, the remnants of a beam, blackened with age, half buried in the mud. When she touched it, the wood crumbled, soft as ash. Beneath it, something faint caught the light. Carved into the stone below, 4 letters. A B-E-L. She froze. The letters were precise, deep, carved with a craftsman's hand. Later that night she stayed in the old inn near town. The storm outside grew fierce. As she reviewed her notes, a gust of wind rattled the shutters and the candle flickered. Somewhere in the distance, faint but steady, she heard it, the tap, tap, tap of a hammer. She stood, heart racing, telling herself it was rain against wood. But the rhythm was too measured, too human. In the morning she returned to the ruins. The beam she'd uncovered was gone. Nothing but a hollow in the ground where it had been. Around it, fresh footprints trailed off toward the tree line. Bare feet. Large. When she told the locals, they didn't look surprised. The old man at the general store just nodded. He comes back when the ground forgets, he said, when folks stop remembering what built it. Over the years, the legend grew. Some said they'd seen a shadow walking the back roads at night. A man carrying a hammer, face calm, eyes burning faintly red. Others swore he appeared at building sites before accidents, whispering warnings no one understood until too late. But not all stories were fearful. Among the descendants of the enslaved, Abel became something else, not a ghost, but a guardian. A reminder that justice may burn slow, but it always burns. His story passed down through hymns and carvings, through the soft chant of work songs that still echoed in the fields. He built it strong, he built it fair. But when they whipped, he said, beware. One nail loose, one beam untrue, the house fell down, the sky turned blue. When Clara published her findings years later, her paper ended not with evidence but a question. Can wood remember the hands that shaped it? Can a soul remain where justice was denied? She never found the answers, but every year on the anniversary of the Harlan fire, Mion left a small wooden hammer at the edge of the ruins. No name, no note, just a single tool, hand-carved, smooth with care.
The years rolled on and Georgia changed. On the surface, at least. Roads cut through the old plantations. Gas stations and motels stood where fields once burned beneath the sun. But some places, no matter how modern the world became, refused to forget. Abel's Field was one of them. By the 1950s, construction crews tried to level it, planning to build a highway that would connect Macon to the coast. They brought in machines, heavy steel teeth meant to rip the earth apart. But the ground fought back. Engines failed. Survey lines vanished overnight. Workers quit after hearing hammering in the woods long after dusk. One man swore he saw a figure standing on the ridge, tall, bare-chested, holding a tool that gleamed in moonlight. Could have been anyone, his foreman said. But the man never came back to work. By the 3rd week, the crew chief, a grizzled veteran of the war, refused to continue. It's the soil, he told the county commissioner. It don't want to move, and maybe it didn't. Because when the highway plan was abandoned, the state records listed a single line in explanation: unstable ground. But for those who lived nearby, they knew the truth. The carpenter still guarded his foundation. In the decades that followed, the legend of Abel took root again, now whispered by elders sitting on porches and sung by bluesmen in roadside bars. They called him the builder of shadows, the man who laid his hammer down only when justice stood level. One song in particular spread across the South. He built their walls, he laid their floor, but they don't own that house no more. When Wood remembered what was true, the master's home came crashing through. By the 1970s, historians began to dig into the fragments of his story: the fire, the trial, the broken rope. But the official archives offered nothing. Court ledgers were missing, the Harlan name erased from kiosks, unti books. The story survived only in whispers and in carvings. In the Museum of Black History in Savannah, a curator once found a strange artifact, a fragment of oak beam, blackened by fire, with 4 letters burned deep into the grain. Abel. No provenance, no record of who donated it. Just a note written in fading ink. He built and broke for us all. The curator displayed it quietly, tucked between exhibits of slave tools and freedom papers. Visitors would pause there longer than anywhere else. Some touched the glass and wept without knowing why. By the time the 21st century arrived, Abel's story had crossed from legend into parable. Professors debated whether he ever existed. Preachers quoted him in sermons about justice. Activists invoked his name at marches, chanting, "Tear down the rotten beams." And yet, deep in rural Georgia, old men still swore the mansion's ruins shifted after storms. One claimed he saw new carvings appear on the fallen stones overnight, the marks of a craftsman's chisel, neat and deliberate. Even scientists studying the soil noted something strange. The field stayed warm beneath the surface, no matter the season. They called it geothermal activity. The locals called it Abel's fire. One winter evening, a storm rolled through. Lightning struck the old oak that once held the gallows. It split clean down the middle, leaving the core hollow, but unburned. Inside the charred trunk, townsfolk found a single wooden hammer, perfectly preserved. No one could explain it. The museum wanted to take it, but the town refused. They built a small glass case around it at the church instead, under a sign that read, "For the one who built and unbuilt what could not stand." At night, the choir would hum an old tune, slow, heavy, like the rhythm of work itself. Some said if you stood by that hammer long enough, you could feel the flow, or beneath your feet tremble, the faint, steady pulse of a heartbeat. And when the light caught the wood just right, the grain looked alive, like the faint outline of a man's hand, forever pressed. Dawn breaks over Georgia, golden light spilling across the misty remains of the Harlan estate. The earth is soft now, reclaimed by moss and wildflowers. Vines twist through what was once marble. Trees rise through the old cellar stones, and the birds sing where the chandeliers used to hang. The land has moved on, but memory has not. A film crew arrives one morning, decades after the last retelling of Abel's story. They're young, dressed in denim and carrying cameras, chasing ghosts and history for a documentary on forgotten builders of the South. Their guide, an elderly man with cloudy eyes and a voice like weathered wood, leads them up the slope to the ruins. "This is where it happened," he says softly. "The fallen of the Harlan house. Folks say it wasn't the fire that took it. It was the truth finally settling in." The crew begins setting up, but the air feels heavy, the kind that presses on your lungs. They find no birds, no sound but the whisper of wind. And when they start recording, the cameras glitch. The frame flickers, static cutting through like someone breathing behind the lens. Later, when they play the footage back, they'll swear they see a figure, tall, shoulders squared, standing among the ruins for just a second. Then gone. The old man sits on a fallen beam, running his hands over the charred surface. "They said he was a carpenter, but that ain't all he was," he murmurs. "He was justice with a hammer. Patience made flesh." One of the younger men laughs nervously. "You really believe that?" The elder looks up, his gaze steady. "Son, belief don't make a story true, but the truth, that's what makes a story stay." He points toward a cluster of stones, half sunk in earth, that there used to be the dining room, where they feasted while his kind starved. Every nail he drove into that floor, he counted the days. He built it strong enough to hold their pride, and weak enough to let it fall. Silence follows. The crew finishes filming, packs up, and drives off toward the city. But that night, one of them can't sleep. He opens his laptop, watches the footage again. In the background of one clip, faint but clear, comes a sound. 3 slow knocks. Wood on wood. He replays it again and again. The rhythm never changes, like someone working, building, waiting. The documentary airs months later and sparks a quiet movement. Architects, craftsmen, and artists begin dedicating their work to Abel's principle, the idea that every structure should stand for something more than itself. That justice, if built right, never collapses. In classrooms across the South, teachers begin telling his story, not as a tale of vengeance, but of balance. A man born into chains who learned to build, and then used that same gift to remind the world that every crooked beam, every rotted floor of cruelty, will one day give way beneath its own weight. The Harland land remains untouched. Developers tried again and again, but the ground never holds. The soil shifts, the walls tilt, and the forest swallows every foundation. Locals say it's cursed. The elders say it's watched over. And somewhere deep beneath the roots, where ash has turned to soil and soil to memory, lies what's left of Abel's final creation. Not a mansion or a monument, but a message. That even in a world built on injustice, the hands of the broken can still craft the fall of the mighty. As the camera fades on that quiet Georgia field, a single voice echoes from the past. Soft, resolute, carried on the wind like a hymn. You can build your house high as heaven, but if you forget the ones beneath it, the ground will take it back. The screen cuts to black. The sound of a hammer, one final strike, rings out.